Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
To help build morale around the country and within our armed forces, long before there was a true professional football league, there was war football. And because of its success, the style of play, the headlines, the fans in the stands, there were many who saw it as a sign that professional football could make it. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we take a look back at the game, World War I style, war football.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 93, War Football. So glad you could join today and listen to this most interesting topic. So, what was war football? When the U.S. entered World War I, many of the colleges and universities were unable to field a team. The landscape had changed. Schools were ravaged by men who withdrew to go fight for their country and defend the U.S. The college game had to take a back seat. And for those schools that were still able to field a team, they also needed to find opponents. The way our armed forces operated and trained, as you might expect, was much different than it is today. Camps were set up all over the country, in almost every state, from coast to coast and border to border. Great football players from the past, the young stars of the day, were thrown together and started playing when they weren't training. Then they started to form teams and play other camps. Before long, records were kept. Heck, schedules were made. Men like Walter Camp reported on these games, ranked teams, and next, there were playoffs and championships. Even the Rose Bowl was contested by two military teams. It was a different time. But it was these games and the quality of play that gave men like George Halas the hope that a true countrywide professional league could be launched, as opposed to smaller circuits that dotted the Midwest, particularly places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. In just a moment, Chris Serb, who was with us just a few weeks ago to talk about the Decatur Staleys, well, he'll be joining us again to talk about war football. Chris is an encyclopedia when it comes to this topic, and several years ago, go figure, wrote a book called War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL. There are so many directions my conversation could have gone with Chris, and we could have spoken for hours. I am quite sure you will thoroughly enjoy what we did talk about, and I encourage everyone who's listening to grab a copy of his book as well, which is available on Amazon. Before we get into today's show, I'd like to remind everyone that you can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook. Look up Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram or visit sportsfh.com for more information about the forgotten heroes I talk about, my guests, and it's a great way to get in touch with me to suggest future guests, future topics. Make a comment. Let me know. Again, that's sportsfh.com. Another reminder, don't forget to give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating for those of you listening on Apple Podcasts. As always, thanks for listening. Okay, war football. What a weird name for a topic, but I promise it's a good one. And here to talk more about war football is my guest, Chris Serb. Chris, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join us again.
Thanks, Warren. It's really good to be here again, and I'm really excited to talk to you about war football.
Yeah, certainly an interesting topic. And I guess the first question I would have for you on this, what stoked your interest in writing about the advent of professional football through the playing of football during World War I?
So I was working on, I was a freelance writer. I was a writer at a couple different magazines, then was kind of a full-time freelance writer on the side of my day job, and was working on an article about George Halas and his time playing for the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Now, growing up in Chicago and knowing a lot about Halas, having his autobiography and having read a couple of books about him, I knew that he played for Great Lakes Naval Training Station, which is about 20 miles north of Chicago's northern border, 20 or 30 miles north, and that they had a top flight football team during World War I. Mm-hmm. But I never knew anything else about military football during World War I. You would have thought that Great Lakes was the only team in the country from the amount of material that I had, because they played top colleges, they played Notre Dame, they played University of Illinois. You know, they did play a Marine team in the Rose Bowl. But so I was writing about George Halas and playing for Great Lakes, and this great season they had, undefeated season. Walter Camp declared them national champions and won the Rose Bowl. George Halas was Rose Bowl MVP. So while I'm scrolling through all the old microfilm, I did my research the old-fashioned way. This was back in 2003 when I was working on this article, so 17 years ago already. Scrolling through the microfilm, I see these articles on the side. Camp Grant defeats Camp Dodge, and Fort Harrison has a big game against Camp Zachary Taylor. And what are these places? I've never heard of them. And so I started to see that this was more than just Great Lakes, clearly more than just Great Lakes. It was a national phenomenon, something that was going on all over the country. And then as I read the stories, it piqued my interest a bit. As I read the stories a little bit closer, I would see names. I would see, George Trafton, he's a Pro Football Hall of Famer. Omar Bradley, he was a 5-star general. You would recognize these, college football Hall of Famers, guys that went on to play in the NFL. So that's really kind of pro football existed at that time, but it was really in its infancy. It wasn't really legitimate. And after the war,
it was very regionalized as well.
Very much so, very much so. It was in the Midwest, largely, and largely in Ohio. You know, you had some in Indiana, you had some in Illinois, but really Ohio, a little bit in Michigan too, kind of the industrial cities, and for the most part, smallish cities too. You know, Chicago had some semi-pro teams. Detroit had a couple of decent semi-pro teams, but it was the cities like Canton and Akron and Massillon, Ohio. You know, not small cities by any stretch, but not big cities either. Mm-hmm. That was really the center of pro football before the war. But after the war, you had this explosion, and it was those same guys that were playing at Fort Harrison, Camp Zachary Taylor, and largely Great Lakes. Great Lakes had a huge influence, not just through George Halas, but many of their other players at Great Lakes that played at Great Lakes really made an imprint on the birth of the NFL. So that's it's something that I had never heard about before, something that really piqued my interest, and it kind of sent me down a rabbit hole. 15 years or so of research and writing and kind of putting the story together and making some hypotheses and being pleasantly surprised when those hypotheses, when the evidence kind of supported what I was looking into.
Well, your book really dives in deep and it explores some of the great names that played back then and the different teams from the different camps. And it was really interesting how you put that together. How did the advent of the Army playing football, the Navy playing football, the Marines playing football, and playing it well contribute to the creation of professional football?
So there were a couple of different things that happened, a couple of factors that all came together. It was kind of a perfect storm of things. The first thing, these really were the first true all-star teams that were ever formed. Walter Camp always had a mythical All-America team. Those teams never played together, not even like you had much later in the century, you had the college all-star team that would play the professional champions. They would actually get together on the field. These guys never played together. Some of them might have played against each other, but some, they might have been in different regions. So these were the first true all-star teams ever assembled, where you had a guy from Illinois, a guy from Harvard, a guy from Michigan, a guy from Notre Dame, just kind of coming together on the field, bringing their different styles, bringing their different experiences, and bringing their darn good football too. These were, it was hard to make some of these teams. At Great Lakes, I think at the initial tryouts, they had something like 500 players show up for the initial tryouts. And these were all fairly seasoned guys that had some football experience behind that. And the team quickly got whittled down. But the fact that these were all-star teams of really high-quality players, former All-Americans and all-conference players and varsity stars coming together. So that was the first factor. The pro football after the war kind of mirrored those teams. The second factor, and this was really important, the public just loved these military teams. The pro football that was played before the war, Canton loved their Bulldogs and Massillon loved their Tigers, but it wasn't like you would get play in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the big papers. But there were big stories about these teams. It was really a big phenomenon back in the time. And they were played in front of sold out crowds and not rinky-dink stadiums either. They played at Wrigley Field, which was then known as Cubs Park, Ebbets Field, Polo Grounds, Harvard Stadium, these really big venues, and sold them out. Now, we don't really know if it was for patriotism's sake or for the high quality football, but I like to believe that a huge part of it was due to the high quality football. And this kind of showed that the public would embrace these kinds of all-star teams. Another big factor, these players, in some cases, they played their last college football game the year before the war, but in some cases they hadn't played in 5 or 10 or even 15 years. They realized they still had a lot of football left in them. Why did they have to quit playing football? Just because they had finished their, at that time, it was usually 3 seasons of college eligibility. In some parts of the country, it was 4, but usually 3 seasons of college eligibility and you're done. So they had already hung up their pads once, and now they've had another taste of football. They realized how much they loved it, and they were ready to keep playing. So that was a huge factor. Another thing, and this was, it's either number 1 or number 1A as far as most important. A lot of barriers to professionalism fell because of the war. Before the war, you had in places like Ohio certainly embraced professional football, but in Chicago, in New York, in places like that, people tended to kind of look down at pro football, not only as inferior to the college game, but kind of associated with roughnecks, with drinkers, with gamblers, with Sabbath breakers. Before the war, there's a writer who wrote a really good book about the dawn of professional football. He calls it the Sunday game. Keith McClellan is the author's name. He noted that only about 20% of pro football players before the war had graduated from college. So now these guys, they're college graduates, they're military veterans. Once they emerged after the war and got into pro football, they kind of broke down a lot of the public's suspicion, I guess, of what professional football was all about what professional football players were like. So you had barriers to professionalism that fell specifically because of the war and because of the kind of clean-cut military veteran that was getting into pro football now. And then this is either number one or number 1A as far as importance. You had this amazing networking effect. Before the war, if you played football, you knew the guys that you played high school football with, the guys that you played college football with, and that was about it. But now if you played at Camp Taylor, you might be playing alongside a guy from Harvard, a guy from Pitt, a guy from Notre Dame, a guy from Illinois. You're all playing together. Maybe you had played against each other. Maybe you had read about each other. Maybe you had never even heard of this guy, but now you're playing together. You're practicing together. If you got over to Europe, you're literally going into battle together. So you got to know these guys really, really well. And then after the war, you could kind of tap into their networks once you were starting a football team. And George Halas did that really, really well. But a couple of other important figures did that too. Guys who truly are sports' forgotten heroes. Bud Talbot did that with the Dayton Triangles. There was this guy, Babe Ruetz, who had played at Camp Hancock in Georgia. He founded the Racine Legion, which was a short-lived but an NFL caliber team. You had several examples of guys like that who really tapped into these networks that probably would have been much more limited networks if not for their time in playing military football. So you had all these factors coming together, and by themselves, one or two or maybe even three of those factors wouldn't have jump-started the NFL the way that they did, but they all came together, and then you had some strong personalities involved too, like George Halas and Bud Talbot and Charlie Brickley and guys like that, and that really kind of made this whole thing happen.
Well, we're going to touch upon some of the individual names that made war football or wartime football what it really became and what it was. But the first name I want to bring up is a name you already mentioned him, and he didn't play, and that is Walter Camp.
Right.
One of the observations you made in your book was how hypocritical Camp was when it came to professional football. He actually didn't like the idea of a professional game, yet he earned a good portion of his living from covering football. So, two questions here. Give us a quick primer on who Walter Camp was and what made him so important when it came to football, and two, why was he so against the professional game?
It's those are two very good questions. So for a quick primer on Walter Camp. So to a lot of the public at the time that the U.S. got involved in World War I, Walter Camp was American football. So American football had only been around. It wasn't even 50 years old once we got into World War I. The first game was played in 1869, and Walter Camp was around for most of football's existence at that point. He started playing at Yale in 1876, and he played. Eligibility rules were a lot looser back then, so he played. I think he played 6 full seasons and part of a 7th season. A little bit sketchy in terms of today, but perfectly acceptable back then when they were still kind of figuring out and defining what eligibility was and who should be allowed to play. But when he was a sophomore at Yale, he got onto football's rules committee, which helped determine what exactly the rules of this game were going to be. So at first, when Walter Camp started playing, there were maybe a dozen colleges playing it. The traditional Ivy League schools were playing football, a couple of other colleges, and they would meet every year. Each school would send a representative. They would meet every year and kind of determine the ground rules for the game. And Walter Camp really pushed rules that would give American football an identity that was different than European rugby or English rugby, which really was its origins were in English rugby. So Walter Camp served on these rules committees and really steered it towards the game that we know today. He was the guy that came up with the idea of a scrimmage instead of a scrum for the ball after every play. He was the guy that came up with the idea of needing a certain amount of plays and a certain amount of yardage to get a first down. It kind of changed over the years, but yeah, it's four downs to gain 10 yards now. At one point, it was 3 downs to gain 5 yards, but that was Walter Camp's idea. Limiting teams to 11 players aside. There were varying numbers during football's early years. I think 15 was kind of standard when Camp was playing, but it was his brainchild to make it 11 players per side. A lot of the innovations of the early game, leading all the way up to the forward pass, which Walter Camp was against. Actually, Walter Camp wasn't a big fan of the forward pass, but for some very practical reasons, actually President Teddy Roosevelt kind of forced it upon Walter Camp and the rules committee that they needed to do something that would make the game a little bit safer. So the forward pass kind of opened up the game and kind of prevented some of the head and neck injuries that were really prevalent in the game, because it was a pretty brutal, violent game at the time. But so he was really important as a rule maker, but he was also just critically important as a kind of an apostle and a proselytizer, I guess, of football's virtues, and kind of poetically on that high level, but also on the basic level. He watched a ton of football, got updates from a lot of different people. He had scouts all around the country telling him who the best football players were, and he would write about the game, and also invented, it was 1889, so he had been done playing for a few years, but he came up with the concept of the All-America team. Now, there's actually some dispute whether that was Walter Camp's idea. Another guy, Park Davis, may have come up with it. I think there's someone else. There's a bit of dispute among historians over whose idea it was, but certainly it's most closely tied to Walter Camp's name. So Walter Camp just wrote, and as you said, it's kind of hypocritical because he was against professionalism. He was against making money off of sports, but he made, tens of thousands of dollars back when tens of thousands of dollars was quite a bit of money. It would be in the millions of dollars today, from writing articles, selling books, and kind of, he was a name that people sought out as a football expert, and he would gladly oblige them by providing bylined articles and writing about the game, writing about specific players, covering certain games. And so he was instrumental in getting football to where it was at the dawn of World War I, which is a pretty darn popular game. It wasn't quite as popular as professional baseball, but it was really close. It was getting there at the time. Mm-hmm. So Walter Camp, at the time that the U.S. got involved in World War I, it looked like American football might die at least for the duration of the war. A lot of colleges were suspending operations, suspending their football teams. A lot of the good players enlisted, and you had kind of untested, inexperienced players and freshmen. A lot of teams got rid of the allowed freshman eligibility during World War I, but it was going to be an inferior brand of football to what you had seen just before the war. But some writers early on in the war were lamenting, we're not going to have great football this year. College football is going to stink. Will the champion even really be a champion? Where a lot of people saw gloom and doom, Walter Camp really saw an opportunity, and not at the college level, but with these war football teams. So that was something that Walter Camp pushed. He was instrumental in setting up. He had an appointment as all the while he was writing and proselytizing about football. He had an appointment, civilian appointment, but as athletic director for the U.S. Navy. So he installed football in the naval stations as a training tool for just common sailors, and then expanded this to the Army. There was a guy, Joseph Raycroft, was Camp's contemporary with the Army, so he kind of pushed this idea on Raycroft, and Raycroft said, let's give it a try. So, if you or I had been drafted, we showed up at a barracks, maybe we had heard about this game, maybe not, maybe we had played high school football, maybe not, but we're just average Joes. And the training camps, the Navy bases, the Army camps would have each barracks, each regiment would get together a football team. So you and I, hey, you look like you're about 6 foot tall, about 180 pounds. I think you'd be a good left tackle. So this was used as a tool to physically harden the young recruits. So that was Walter Camp's first push, was to kind of expand and broaden the use of football as a training tool and as a tool for improving morale, keeping soldiers and sailors occupied, and things like that. So that was kind of part A of war football. But part B was he saw the opportunity. You had these training camps. They were little cities that sprung up in the middle of nowhere, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 soldiers or sailors or Marines. And when you had this little city built, you had all these people there. A couple of hundred of them had played college football. Maybe, 4 or 5 had been All-Americans. These were damn good players. So Walter Camp was the first to really realize that, not just regimental football or intramural football as a training tool, but that varsity level football played by these training camps could be, for one thing, a good recreational tool for the soldiers and sailors. They'd go watch the games on Saturdays. But for another thing, a good way to spread the word about the U.S. military, to raise money for the war effort by playing, playing each other and playing the top colleges in front of these packed crowds. So Walter Camp really, where others saw doom and gloom, Walter Camp saw an opportunity. He saw that that the war might be the greatest thing that ever happened to football.
Your book, War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL, you put it together in a very interesting way. Like I said earlier, you touched upon different teams and different people. And we're going to touch upon some of them as well for no other reason than I just want to talk a little more about some of the people and some of the teams that you discuss. We can't touch upon all of them. We'd be here for quite some time.
Right.
But the one I want to start off with, and it's because of, military history and names or whatever, Bertie Gardner, Camp Custer, and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Who was Bertie Gardner? And tell us about Camp Custer and its team.
Okay. So Bertie Gardner was, so at the time of World War I, Bertie Gardner was aging, but he still had a lot of good football in him. He was, I think, he might have been 34 during the season that he played for Camp Custer. But so he was an aging veteran, but this was really his last hurrah when he played for Camp Custer. So Camp Custer was in Battle Creek, Michigan. Bertie himself had played at Carlisle Indian School about a decade before. He hadn't been an All-American, but he had been on some really good Carlisle teams. I think his last year he played with Jim Thorpe. But these were the Carlisle teams that would go in and upset University of Pennsylvania back when they were a powerhouse, or University of Chicago. I don't remember exactly who Gardner's teams beat, but they really wowed them. And even when they didn't beat a Harvard, which again was a national power at the time, if they lost by 1 or 2 points, it was, if there was a point spread, if the point spread had existed back then, it would have favored Harvard by 20 at the time. And so they were. So at Carlisle, he was a really good player. He played end, and he was part of one of the first effective forward passing attacks. The forward pass was legalized in college football in 1906, and I think 1907 might have been his last year of college football. So during those 2 seasons, Carlisle really just used it as an effective weapon to really shock and surprise and trick some of these powerhouse teams that were really run, and then run a little bit more, maybe try 1 or 2 passes during the game just to keep people on their toes, but really a run heavy diet. Are you going left, or are you going right, or are you going up the middle, were kind of the choices. So Pop Warner was a really innovative coach, and Bertie Gardner was a really effective player for Pop Warner. So he had, after graduating Carlisle, he had gone to law school. He had done some coaching. He had kind of done the circuit. He played a little bit of the semi-pro football, but once he landed at Camp Custer, he landed there as an officer. I believe he was a captain at Camp Custer, and he was also captain and coach of the football team. So Camp Custer was a very good football team, and Gardner was their best player, kind of their driving force. They had a couple of guys who had played at Michigan State. Jerry DiPrato was one of them. Blake Miller was another one of them. They were both Michigan State at the time wasn't in the Big Ten, but they were all Western type of football players. And then they both got kicked out of school for playing pro football under assumed names. But they were kind of a powerhouse school. They swept through their regular season. One game that's really interesting that Bertie had a big impact on. They played against the Detroit Heralds, which was a really good semi-pro football team. at the time. And one of Gardner's players, Jerry DiPrato, one of the Michigan State guys that I mentioned, he was the recipient of a cheap shot and he got knocked out of the game. So Birdie warned the referee, said, "Mr. Referee, we're not going to stand for that." So he goes into the huddle and Birdie, who normally played end, said, "Move me to fullback," because he saw that the other guy would be lined up right opposite him. So Birdie, he doesn't take the ball. He just plows right into the guy, throws a vicious block, and knocks him out of the game. So then he got his revenge, and then he said, "Okay, now we can go back to playing football." But so Camp Custer was undefeated all season until they lost. They lost their final game, which is kind of a hastily arranged Midwest Army Championship. Camp Grant of Rockford, Illinois, was their opponent, but Birdie himself almost willed his team to victory. They're down, they're losing 14-0 in the fourth quarter. Birdie blocked a field goal right into one of his teammates' arms. The teammate returned it all the way down to the 15 line, and they punched it in a couple of plays later. Then on the next series, Birdie ripped the ball out of a Camp Grant ball carrier's hands, single-handedly returned it almost 60 yards for a touchdown. So a couple of brilliant plays, but a missed extra point cost them the win. They wound up losing by 1 point, but not for any lack of effort on Birdie's part. So kind of he only played a couple of games. Again, he was aging. He only played a couple of games in the early NFL, but definitely one of the big stars of the 1917 season during war football.
Mm-hmm. Another name you mentioned was Bud Talbot. Mm-hmm. How important was he in the eventual formation of professional football? And by that, I mean, wasn't it Talbot and his Camp Sherman team that toured through Ohio to raise money for the 83rd Division Welfare Fund? And they met with a lot of success. A lot of people came out to buy tickets to help them raise money for the Army. So I would have to think that had to be an eye-opener for a lot of people, saying, wow, people will actually come and pay money for good football.
I think it definitely was. It definitely was. Now Talbot already had a little bit of experience in pro football, or I guess it would be semi-pro football at the time. Talbot had played at Yale. He had been an All-American at Yale. And then he moved back. He was from Dayton. He moved back and got into business, but he dabbled in coaching, coached this kind of ragtag semi-pro team, the Dayton Triangles, and then joined the Army, enlisted in the Army once America got into World War I. So he volunteered to be the coach of the Camp Sherman team. And when he saw who he had at practice, he had these guys that were, he had a couple of former All-Americans. He also had these guys that had played at smaller colleges in Ohio who were really, really good players that, would have been big names if they had gone to an Ohio State or a Michigan or a Harvard or places like that. But they had gone to kind of the smaller schools like Marietta and places like that, College of Wooster, maybe some places that didn't quite get the national press. But these were really good football players. So when Talbot saw the kind of team that he had, it's exactly as you said, he set up a barnstorming tour. We're going to go through Ohio and we're going to play colleges, other military teams, etc. And we're going to play at big venues. We're not going to it's not just going to be playing at camp in front of the soldiers, although the soldiers are certainly welcome, but we're going to go play at Cincinnati Reds Field, Redland Field. We're going to go play in Cleveland at Cleveland's League Park. We're going to go to these big venues and we're going to sell them out. And that's exactly what they did. So they did extremely well. They raised the equivalent of what would be $3 million in today's dollars. And they did so without the benefit of luxury boxes, with a big stadium at the time might have been 20,000 seats or 15,000 seats. So if they were playing in today's stadiums, they would have certainly done even better than that. And $3 million or the equivalent of $3 million is pretty darn impressive. So he took that experience personally. Other people saw that and said, there might be a lucrative market in pro football. Bud Talbot himself took that experience to heart too. When after the war, he went back to Dayton, went back to doing his business work, but also continued to dabble with coaching for the Dayton Triangles. But he bumped up the level of player, the level of competition, and kind of took the Dayton Triangles to new heights. They wound up being one of the inaugural entries into the NFL. In fact, the Triangles played in the first game in NFL history, which they beat the Columbus Panhandles 14-0. That was exactly 100 years ago here, about a month ago. But he took a couple of players from Camp Sherman. Naki Rupp was one of the guys. I just love that name, Naki. Tiny Turner, Tiny, of course, weighed about 230 pounds. And so he had three former Camp Sherman players, but he had, I think it was 11 war football veterans in total. So he really bumped it up from just being a factory town team to being a high-level professional team. So Bud Talbot was really important in getting the NFL started over those first 10 years. He only coached the Triangles for 2 years, and he was quite good. They were definitely over 500 in those years. They were not up there with the Canton Bulldogs, Akron Pros, and Decatur Staleys, but they were just like that, kind of that next tier below them. But Talbot got out of coaching, got into business full time, rejoined the military, and was for World War II, and was ultimately promoted to general. So kind of an example of one of those guys who, was a damn good football player, but football wasn't the end game for him. He had much higher heights, but a really important figure, not only in war football, but in getting the NFL started.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to Walter Camp for a moment. He's watching all of this, isn't he? And despite his opposition to professional football, he's got to be thinking, there's something here.
Absolutely. Walter Camp was, he could kind of get flowery when he was talking about football's promise and what you could expect from football. And it seems like I read many of his old guidebooks, many of his, this is what we expect in the 1905 season and 1908 season. I read a lot of those as research, and it seems like every season was going to be the greatest season ever. But 1917, he was very optimistic about what military football might do for the sport of football, and kind of said this might be the greatest season ever. Now, some of the camps were really good and some weren't so good because of lack of teamwork, lack of practice time, for some other reasons. So in 1917, you could probably say that college football and military football were maybe on an equal footing. Maybe college football was even just a little bit better than military football, because a lot of guys who volunteered to enlist were told, hold on a second, we haven't finished building the camps. We don't quite have the capacity. Just wait, we'll call you in February or March or so. So they got to go back to their colleges and play. But in 1918, his dreams were fully realized. War football, military football was head and shoulders above the college game in the 1918 season. All of the best players were at these Army, Navy, and Marine training camps, with the exception of those that had played in 1917 and then were already off in Europe doing the fighting. But the highest class football was played in 1918, and you just have to think that Walter Camp was going through the roof, seeing, wow, I created this, and this is, or I had a large part in creating this anyway, and this is really something special. So he definitely could smile on his handiwork after seeing what it had become.
Mm-hmm. So this brand of football, this military game, it's got to be capturing the fancy of the American public at this point as well. Let's examine a few things here. How were the colleges affected by this? After all, their stars were going on to the armed forces. The colleges had to have been affected.
Absolutely. They, a lot of the, as I said, some of the schools, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, most notably, which were powerhouses back then, dropped football for the duration of the war. Harvard did play with an informal, uncoached team during the war, but a lot of the big powerhouse schools either dropped football or scaled football back. If the really good players were off in the military, and you still did have a football team. The really good players' places were filled by, guys that might have been fourth string or some kind of untested freshman. So the college brand of football was suffering, but military football was able to fill the gap in. These, you could basically see Ohio State play. You would just have to go to five different military camps to see the camp in action, and you could read about their exploits in the papers too. The newspapers of the day. Fortunately they did capture a wonderful record of what went on in the football back then. They really don't write them like they used to. They really captured who was doing what, how they were doing, and what the atmosphere was like. So that was really neat to see. And
that's
and
a really interesting point you bring up there. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've got to. It's my show.
Sure.
Newspaper coverage. I think part of the reason that professional football did not catch on at this point or up to this point is because it didn't get a whole lot of coverage in the newspapers. College football did, but you might see a line or two, maybe a paragraph at most, to recap a quote-unquote professional football game, while the colleges were still getting some really good coverage. But with the advent of war football, coverage became bigger. There was more write-ups about the game. How did what was going on with newspaper coverage also affect the advent of professional football?
Yeah, so I think you kind of captured it by saying, now again in the cities like Canton or Decatur or places like that, they wrote about their pro football teams and wrote about them really well, but those stories just weren't picked up by the wire services. But if you had a powerhouse team like a Great Lakes or a Camp Sherman or out west, you had the Mare Island Marines, you had Kelly Field down in Texas, some real powerhouse teams. These stories were getting picked up by the press wire. So I'm let's say I'm in North Dakota. I'm reading about this team in Georgia that's really something. And these names that maybe I had never heard about in North Dakota because they played at schools that just didn't get into the press wires. That word got out to me. So it definitely spread word about these players, these teams all around the country, and kind of expanded the reputations of a lot of these players. Again, like one of those barriers to professionalism that I talked about before. Wait a second. This guy's okay. I remember he played for Camp Greenleaf. He played for Great Lakes. He played for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I read about that somewhere. Okay, I won't look down my nose at him for playing pro football anymore. It definitely captured the public's fancy, and then made those names a little bit more recognizable by the time they got out of the armed services and got into professional football.
Mm-hmm. Well, before I interrupted you, we were talking about how the colleges were affected, and one of the cool things I think was that you had young college stars, guys who left their schools to join the armed forces, to fight for their country. They end up playing football for whichever camp they're in. There are old college stars there too, guys who had played the college game, but their days of playing college ball were long gone. How did young and old mix?
It seems like it took a little while for them to gel on the field, but once they gelled, they really figured things out well. Not unlike a rookie finding his place on a team today. He might have all the physical tools in the world, but how do we fit him into this lineup? This whole defense has been playing together. We've got this superstar linebacker, but how does he fit in with what we've been doing? So it might take a couple of games to figure that out. But one thing that you saw in war football in 1917. It took a lot longer for teams to gel than in 1918. In 1918, for one thing, yes, they called open tryouts maybe in mid to late August, but these guys had been knowing each other for a couple of months. In 1917, they've literally just arrived. The final nails were still being put in the barracks in late August, and then these guys are showing up in September, and then by September 15th, oh yeah, let's have a football team. Walter Camp is pushing football. So the brand of football and the way that the players melded in 1917 wasn't quite as good as in 1918. In 1918, they had already been around each other. They had been training together. They had been recreationalizing together. Many of them had played baseball for their camp's baseball teams, so they knew each other personally. So even if you were 5 or 8 or 10 years older than this whippersnapper, you knew them. You were starting to learn their reputation. You were starting to get along on a personal level, and that just made it easier on the field of play, I think.
Mm-hmm. How good was the quality of play? I mean, you said before there were some camps, some teams that, they didn't perform all that well, but then there were some that really did. I mean, you even had some of these great military teams beat superior college teams like Pitt, coached by Pop Warner. So there had to have been some teams that were just totally outstanding.
Absolutely. I could rattle off a handful by name. We'll get to that. Don't let me forget about that Pitt and Pop Warner team and playing the Cleveland Naval Reserves. That was one of the best games of war football. But certainly George Halas's Great Lakes team was outstanding. It was probably the best team during the war football era. They had they went 7. They won 7. They lost none. They did tie 2 games during the year. One against Notre Dame, which featured a guy named George Gipp, was their star halfback who scored Notre Dame's only touchdown. So there was it was a 7-7 tie. And then the other tie was against Northwestern, my alma mater actually. But Northwestern was only okay that year, but they played on a really muddy field. That kind of Great Lakes missed a bunch of field goal attempts in that game. So probably kind of an anomaly, but they went undefeated. They won the Rose Bowl. They didn't have a ton of All-Americans. They did have a couple of second and third team All-Americans and whatnot, but they had a lot of like all conference caliber players. They were a very deep team. And then George Halas was on that team. And I know this is sports as forgotten heroes, and Halas certainly isn't forgotten, no. But this aspect of his career really is. And honestly, war football and his season at Great Lakes might be the most important thing, because Halas was really a pretty average college player. Mm-hmm. It took war football to turn him into a star. He was second team All Service. Walter Camp named an All Service team instead of an All American team for the military players. But Halas made second team All Service. He was Rose Bowl MVP. He scored a touchdown. He made a key interception late in the game. War football really. He probably would have tried to play pro football after the war, but it was through war football that he really was able to emerge, not only as a star, but again, as we talked about, develop those networks and tap into those networks that helped him build a team after the war. So Great Lakes was certainly the best, but the Mare Island Marines were very good for 2 seasons, and they were totally different teams. The 1917 team, which won the 1918 Rose Bowl, was dominated by old Oregon players. The 1918 team, which lost to Great Lakes in the 1919 Rose Bowl, but they had gone undefeated and put up some really huge scores before that too. They were dominated by Washington State players. But they were a very good team. The Cleveland Naval Reserves, we'll touch upon them in a minute. Kelly Field, which I didn't write about. I only touched upon them in war football because they didn't have as much influence on the professional game, but they were undefeated down in Texas. Camp Greenleaf in Georgia, they were undefeated, and they had a great player who got his first taste of coaching, Jock Sutherland, who wound up going on to be a college Hall of Fame coach and coaching in the pros as well. Over in Europe, you had this AEF tournament. The 89th Division was the best team over there. They went undefeated and looked really good doing so. So you had some really, really good teams that a lot of them are forgotten, but we really should be remembering them. If you're remembering Newt Rockney's Notre Dame teams in the 1920s, that Great Lakes team could have, they did play Newt Rockney's. That was Newt Rockney's first team in 1918 that they played. But that Great Lakes team was just as good as Rockney's best team. You had some really high quality, high caliber football that really was forgotten solely because a lot of these camps demobilized. Military football, with the exception of the Quantico Marines, military football really didn't was downplayed. Yeah, you might have a camp team, but they didn't have the All-Americans, they didn't have the All-Conference players. They would maybe play another military camp, but they weren't playing in front of the packed crowds and with the kind of college atmosphere that you had during World War I. So it's kind of a misfortune of history that it's long been forgotten. But then again, it was an opportunity for me that I was able to tell that story.
Chris, I would be remiss, especially in today's environment, if I didn't ask about 1918, the pandemic. Mm-hmm. How did the Spanish flu affect football? And if I remember correctly, you actually write about a theory on how it actually spread.
So, these and this isn't my research, of course. This is research that's been put together by some pretty reputable historians that I just kind of borrowed and cited and stuff in my book. But it's largely believed to have started at Camp Funston in Kansas, at a military camp. And not necessarily started, but that's largely believed to the primary means of the influenza spreading from troop transfers. You'd go from Camp Funston to, some camp in Georgia, and then maybe to a camp in Maryland, and then an embarkation port up in New Jersey, and then you'd sail across the Atlantic. So you're coming into contact with people and kind of spreading this. So the frequent troop movements, the fact that the troops were crowded into these tight barracks and, with not much circulation, a kind of a recipe for disaster. Things we're being warned about these days with the COVID-19 pandemic. Those situations were ripe at the military camps back in 1918, kind of ripe for spreading the flu. And a lot of soldiers and sailors and Marines did die. It disproportionately, especially compared to COVID, disproportionately affected young people, people in the prime of their lives. But it did have a huge effect on football because the worst wave of the 1918 influenza pandemic came right during that fall of 1918, right when football season was starting up. So some teams got in an early game in late September or early October, and then had to shut down operations for a couple of weeks. It kind of hit different areas of the country at different rates. So in some parts of the country, it was early in the season. Some parts it was the middle of the season. Some parts it was late in the season. But it was really affected. You had just widespread cancellations of games. Great Lakes was supposed to play University of Pittsburgh, which was the college champion in 1918. They were supposed to play. This would have been one heck of a game, the best team in military football against the best team in college football. So Great Lakes went so far as to get on a train, got all the way to Pittsburgh, and then the health authorities shut the game down and sent Great Lakes turning right back around and sent them right back to Chicago. But and in some cases you had restricted audiences. They might have only allowed 1,000, people at most in stadiums that could seat 10,000, kind of like some of the things you might see in college football today with COVID. And in some cases, which you're seeing in the Big Ten right now, games were played in front of barred doors, empty stadiums, only the players. So it kind of imperiled that 1918 season. And, if a typical football season might have been 9 games back then, a lot of teams only got to play 5 or 4 or maybe 6 games. So they didn't get the full season in. A handful of teams did get the full season in. But the pandemic really threatened football. But once it had passed in certain areas, some of some of the areas, some of the regions expanded the season a couple of extra weeks, and you did have some really high quality football finally towards the end of that season.
Okay, so you spoke about so many of the best war football teams, and now it's time to talk about a couple, 3 or 4 of them. And you said, don't let me forget to talk about Pitt and Pop Warner. So let's start there. Tell us about Pitt and their games against some of, these great military teams.
Right. So Pop Warner had been, his name is synonymous with youth football, which is kind of funny because he never coached youth football.
Right.
He was, by all accounts, he was kind of a profane guy. He was a chain smoker. He cussed a lot. Kind of a tough, gruff guy. But he's associated with youth football because he was very kind to a youth group that they asked him to speak at a dinner, and they asked a bunch of coaches to come speak, and he was the only one that showed up and told stories and was encouraging to the kids. So even though he never coached the Pop Warner level kids, that's how it got their name. So his name is definitely remembered today. But back in the day, Pop was one of the best known college football coaches. He had coached Jim Thorpe at Carlisle and coached them into a national powerhouse. And then after he left Carlisle, he went to University of Pittsburgh and turned them into a national powerhouse. They had been undefeated for several seasons leading into World War I. And kind of early on, I think I have this quote in the book. Warner said something super patriotic. He said, "I don't give a rap if we win a football game this year," kind of implying that all our effort's going to go to the war effort. He clearly didn't mean that. That was in 1917, and he, Pop and Pitt, for one thing, he got kind of lucky in 1917 because many of his best players were in dental school. So they registered for the draft. They, in some cases, they volunteered for service. And the Army said, well, actually, we could use these guys as dentists, not just as infantrymen. So let them finish out their dental school there. So Pop had a pretty decent, they called them the fighting dentists in 1917. So some of the Jack Sutherland, who we had already talked about, who coached at Camp Greenleaf, was one of those fighting dentists. But Jack Sutherland and a couple of other really good players had graduated, but they did have some of their core guys back, some All-American college football Hall of Fame caliber guys. And they were widely acknowledged as the college national champions that year. They beat Georgia Tech, who had won the previous year's college national championship. They beat them, didn't just beat them, they pummeled them, something like 32-0. So Pitt was a really good, really high quality football team in 1918. One of the colleges that really excelled despite the war, the influence of the war, and despite the pandemic. But Cleveland Navy was a pretty darn good team too. Their strength really was in their backfield. They had a guy named Moon Dussault, who had played at Auburn, and had been really good, kind of an all Southern caliber football player. Wasn't an All-American, but mostly because of regional bias. He probably was good enough to be an All-American. But the real gem of the team was Pete Stinchcomb, who had been at Ohio State. He had been a sophomore at Ohio State in 1917 when they won the Big Ten for the first time, and then now he's enlisted in the Navy, and he's playing for the Cleveland Naval Reserves in 1918. After the war, he would be an All-American. He would lead Ohio State to its first Rose Bowl. But before the war, Pete had kind of been in the shadow of an even better player at Ohio State, a guy named Chick Harley, who, by the way, also played war football. He played for Air Base down in Florida. But now at Cleveland, Pete kind of had the chance to be the man. He kind of had the chance to stand out. So this midway through the season, this led to a big blunder. Cleveland was playing another really good team, the Chicago Naval Reserves, which trained at Navy Pier here in Chicago, played their games at Wrigley Field. Stinchcomb tried to trick the Chicago defense. They're down 6-0. They're driving the ball. He's decided that we're on the 2-yard line. They're expecting a run. I think I'm going to throw a pass. Well, he threw the pass incomplete into the end zone. Under the rules of the day, that's a touchback. It's Chicago Naval Reserves ball, game over, basically. So Pete's blunder cost them the game.
Oh, boy.
Against Pitt, Pete kind of had a chance to redeem himself. He played extremely well in the Cleveland versus Pitt game. It was a really hard-fought game. Pitt kind of had the advantage for most of the game, but they were playing their third game in 7 days, and they kind of wore down towards the end of the game. So late in the fourth quarter, or midway through the fourth quarter, I forget which it was, but Pitt's just starting to wear down, starting to get exhausted. Pete calls a trick play. It's what we would call a flea flicker today. So Mundu Sot, Pete gets the snap from the center, pitches it to Mundu Sot, and then circles around right end and catches the ball in stride for a 35-yard touchdown. And Cleveland Naval Reserves winds up beating Pitt, the college champion, 10-9 in a huge upset. And kind of the game, definitely the game that sticks out is the one that kind of, even though it was close, this tells the world that that war football, military football, is superior to the college game, at least for that 1918 season. So Pop Warner didn't take too kindly to it, by the way. He insisted that he had been cheated. He refused to acknowledge this game in Pitt's permanent record for the rest of his life and for decades after. It's finally in Pitt's record if you look in Pitt's media guide. But just a really good game and a really exciting one that I wish I had been there at. I read the newspaper accounts and it's like, boy, I wish I could have been right down there on the 35-yard line, maybe close enough to hear Pop Warner cussing out the referee.
Sure, that would be fun. I asked you about, a couple of the good teams, and I think this next question leads into some more of those good teams, and we're going to talk about the West Coast. One of the biggest controversies amongst these teams was which teams would play in the 1919 Rose Bowl. Tell us about that entire situation, because there were several teams out on the West Coast who thought they had the right to play in that game, the 1919 Rose Bowl, and they ended up having to go through a playoff to get there.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So on paper, if you were just reading the scores, you would have said the Mare Island Marines were the best team on the West Coast. Just if you looked at some of their scores, they were winning these games, 89-0, just kind of dominating these teams. But then when you look a little bit closer, you saw that they were playing kind of these teams that just weren't very good. The Goat Island Navy Yard. I don't even know what Goat Island is. I'm sure if I looked on a map of California, I might be able to find it. But this clearly a small base. And it's partly because of the pandemic. They were playing whoever they could play at the time. They were playing some. They were playing some teams, playing some games that maybe weren't the best caliber. So you had a bunch of other teams out on the West Coast that thought that they deserved a chance to be part of the conversation, that thought that they deserved a Rose Bowl berth. So there was, I think it was the Los Angeles Times. They said that the picture was about as clear as restaurant coffee. So it was a bunch of different teams vying for berths. So the Mare Island Marines were, again, they were mostly Washington State guys. Lone Star Dietz, who had coached Washington State, who had played for Pop Warner at Carlisle, was their coach. They had run through that season. It was some absurd score. What did they have? They racked up 410 points in 8 regular season games. Their opponents scored 7.
Yeah, it was crazy number.
Yeah, they were just a darn good football team on paper. But again, there were several other undefeated teams. They all wanted a chance. So the Tournament of Roses committee said, okay, there will be a playoff. So that's kind of interesting because in Chicago, Great Lakes, which had that really good season, but they did have the 2 ties. There was another team, the Chicago Naval Reserves, that beat Pete Stinchcomb and the Cleveland Naval Reserves. They were undefeated and they wanted a chance to play for the title and the chance to play in the Rose Bowl. And initially, the captain that oversaw both bases said yes, and then listened to the arguments from Great Lakes' coach about we need the training time. We need to do this. We need to do that. We play better competition than them. And then ultimately sided with Great Lakes. So, but Mare Island wasn't so lucky. They kind of had to run the gauntlet there. So, you had the San Diego Naval Training Station. You had Rockwell Field. You had Mare Island. You had Mather Field that had a really good quarterback from Pitt, who Pop Warner had coached. So they kind of ran the gauntlet, and Mare Island Marines did end up being the best team on the West Coast, but they were beat up. They played their last game on Christmas Day, just 7 days before the Rose Bowl, and it was a hard-fought game too. They won. I think that was the one they beat the San Diego Navy, and it was 12-7 was the final score. So it was they couldn't rest their starters in that game. They had a dogfight on their hands. So meanwhile, Great Lakes has had a month off. They had a leisurely train trip. They got to visit Universal Studios and the Orange Groves and a submarine base. They had kind of this leisurely trip, and they practiced hard too, but they definitely weren't, Great Lakes wasn't beat up. They weren't physically or emotionally beat up the way that Mare Island was. Mm-hmm. So, Mare Island ran the gauntlet, and then they ultimately ran into a buzzsaw once they played Great Lakes, which they did as good as Mare Island was. Great Lakes kind of had their number in the Rose Bowl. Great Lakes won it 17-0 behind George Halas, Patty Driscoll, Jimmy Conzelman coming off the bench. A third, all three were Pro Football Hall of Famers. Jimmy Conzelman was a great player, but Great Lakes was so stacked that this guy who would eventually be in the Hall of Fame didn't even start there. He had to come off the bench. So. A deep team, a good team, and put together some really good football.
Mm-hmm. Chris, there's two other names that we have to talk about. The first, you already mentioned him, but we didn't get into his kind of game, and that's Omar Bradley.
Right.
Tell us about Omar Bradley and his contribution to war football.
Okay. So Omar Bradley, his name rings down in history as the chief ground commander during D-Day and during much of the liberation of Europe during World War II, the last of America's five-star generals. But back in the 1910s, he was mostly known for being an athlete. He was actually a very, very good baseball player. I think he led the West Point team in batting average when he was there. But he also played football at West Point. He was on the Army team that won the national championship. I believe that was the 1914 season. He was class of 1915. I believe it was the 1914 season, but he was a backup. He only played in a couple games. He definitely earned his, if there was such a thing as a championship ring back then, he definitely earned his ring, but he definitely wasn't one of the stars. But Bradley wanted to get into the war. He was career Army officer, wanted to get over into Europe, and his orders to ship overseas came through and then were immediately canceled when the armistice was declared. He was supposed to leave right around the time that the armistice was declared. So he was stuck at Camp Dodge in Des Moines, Iowa. But the good thing is Camp Dodge had a football team, so he signed up for and played for the football team. And he had missed the first couple of games because he'd been so deeply involved in the preparations and the training for getting ready to ship overseas. But now that he had all this time on his hands, he played for the last few games for Camp Dodge. He played tackle. And what was most noteworthy about Omar Bradley during his war football experience, he didn't go on to play in the NFL or anything like that, but during one of the games for Camp Dodge was playing University of Iowa, which had one of the best tackles in the college game at the time. He was just a freshman at the time, but a guy named Duke Slater, who ended up being a college. Duke. Yeah, Duke ended up being a college football Hall of Famer. He just recently was named to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, probably 30 or 40 years after he should have been. But he was one of only a few black players in major college football at the time. So before the game, the referee, who was Walter Eckersall, one of the great names in football too, and a big booster of war football, kind of approached Omar Bradley on the side, and I wanted to have a little conversation with him because Bradley was from the South, and he Eckersall asked, "Hey, is it okay that you're going to be playing against a black player?" And kind of the implication was, although Eckersall was pretty progressive, extremely progressive on race relations in his day, but kind of the implication was, if you don't want to play against a black player, just tell me. I'll tell Iowa to bench him. We'll take care of this. But Omar Bradley, to his credit, said, "Nope, I just want to play football." And he promised that at least on the football field, he would be colorblind and play fair with Duke Slater. And that's how the game shook out. A couple of Bradley's teammates from Camp Dodge weren't so kind. They kind of kicked Slater when he was down and took a couple of cheap shots, knocked him to the ground. And then it was always Omar Bradley over there helping him up, giving him a hand, helping him to his feet. So kind of an interesting story, an interesting tidbit, because ultimately, this Southerner who grew up in a very segregated society, grew up under Jim Crow, or on the oppressive side of Jim Crow, I guess, but agreed to play square with his black opponent back in 1918. He was the guy who wound up desegregating the Army 30 years later as Army Chief of Staff under President Harry Truman. So I like to think that maybe his war football experience kind of foreshadowed the military and the country and its long and sometimes frustratingly slow, but a bend towards justice and a bend towards equality of opportunity. So kind of an interesting tidbit from 1918 that carried over through the years.
And by the way, anybody wants to learn more about Duke Slater, check out Sports Forgotten Heroes episode number 39. Spent a lot of time talking about Duke Slater. The most accomplished of the generals to play, at least I think, later became a president, Dwight Eisenhower. Tell us about his ability on the field and his contribution to wartime football.
Right. So at the time of World War I, if you knew the name of Dwight Eisenhower, you probably knew him as a football man, because he had played on Army's team. He was a starter on Army's varsity back in 1912, starting halfback. He was just a sophomore back then, but he was a really, really good player. He was a starter. He really held his own in a tough loss to Carlisle and Jim Thorpe. He tackled Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe got the better of him a couple of times. Years later, Jim Thorpe was asked during an interview what he remembered about Eisenhower, who at that time was either running for president or already was president. And Thorpe kind of smiled and nodded his head and said, good linebacker. Now linebacker wasn't a position back then, but the halfback position he played, depending on how the formation went, would be what we would recognize as a linebacker today. So Eisenhower was a really good player as a sophomore, but he tore up his knee late in the season and he had to quit playing football. He was just done, but he took up coaching instead. So he helped coach the junior varsity at Army at a couple of his initial stateside assignments after he graduated from the military academy. He did a little bit of coaching. He coached a military school down in Texas. But where he really got involved in war football, he coached the 12th Division All-Stars during the Mexican border crisis, which was kind of a precursor to war football. This was the winter of 1916, 1917, right before the U.S. got involved in World War I. There was a large deployment of National Guard troops down to the Texas-Mexico border, and one of the things that the high officials decided to do to keep the troops busy was to sponsor football games. Let's keep them away from the saloons and the red light districts by throwing this big football tournament. So Ike coached the 12th Division All-Stars during this tournament. It's possible, but I haven't found definitive evidence that he may have coached at Camp Colt in Pennsylvania, where he commanded the Tank Corps. Camp Colt put a football team together, but then they wound up canceling their games, both because of the influenza pandemic and a couple other reasons. So we don't have a record of Camp Colt's actually playing, so we don't know who their coach was. So, Ike might have been their coach. He might have been one of their coaches. We don't have definitive evidence there. But after the war, and Ike, like Bradley, was frustrated that he never got over to Europe to be part of the fighting. It's how you really wanted to make your bones as a young officer. But he kept coaching at Army bases for a few years after the war. He coached at Camp Meade in Maryland. He coached at Fort Benning in Georgia. And then eventually, during the mid to late 1920s, he started the long and at the time slow, because the military was downscaling after World War One, but started the long climb up the military ladder that ultimately ended up with him being supreme commander during World War II, and then ultimately ended up with him getting to the White House. But Ike never forgot his football experience, never forgot what being a football guy was all about. And he always integrated football into his leadership style.
Well, and that's where I was going to go. He liked to use football terminology in battle. I mean, he eventually made his way into battle, and on the front lines, he'd tell his troops, pull an end run, hit the line, break through. He liked the strategy of the game, and he was able to relate it to the actual battlefield. You hear a lot about that, how football and battles relate. Can you expand on that thought and tell us how the two actually work in conjunction with each other?
Right. It's really kind of interesting when you go back to some of the old writings. Walter Camp, who we already talked about, it's funny how he would always clearly use the football terminology, hit the line hard, pull an end run, etc. But what he would relate football to back in the day was a modern corporation, because Walter Camp, he made quite a bit of money from football, but his big profession was at a clock company where he started out as a salesman and he ended up being the president. But he saw, football players as cogs in a machine, and, the efficiently run corporation, relating that to a football, and how a quarterback is a game manager, things like that. Well, once we got involved in World War One, he kind of changed his lingo. So, the forward passing became artillery work, and you had all this language that more related to the military aspect of football. And I think that's kind of an aspect that's stuck over the years. You certainly saw it with Eisenhower, a lot of the language that he would use. And he would also say that it was no coincidence that a lot of his top generals, including Omar Bradley, but also George Patton, some really key generals, some big figures. I think George Marshall, who was back stateside as Army Chief of Staff during World War II, but I think he had been involved in football. Some of the really important lieutenants that helped Ike win the war had been football players, and he said that was no coincidence. That was really, the two kind of went hand in hand. Mm-hmm. You knew football helped teach you leadership. It helped teach you confidence, helped teach you self-reliance. It taught you how to look out for the guy on your left and the guy on your right and the guy behind you. A lot of these things that applied to the battleground and fighting in the trenches and being part of an efficient military unit, learning chain of command, how to take orders, when to take personal initiative, a lot of traits. And Walter Camp really pushed that too. That was kind of his argument for why we had to roll football out among all the military camps during World War One. This is gonna develop your soldiers just as much as going on long marches and maybe taking rifle practice. Obviously you need the rifle practice if you're going to go into battle, but the football is gonna harden some of those skills that it might be hard to put your finger on, but some of those skills that really do make a good soldier.
Mm-hmm. Chris, your book, War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL, is filled with so much, and your knowledge of that period of time is so deep and you speak so well about it. We could spend so much more time talking about it, but then I'd be giving away the whole book. And I encourage everybody, even though the book was written several years ago, it is such a great read. The way you put it together, we're not talking about 20, 30, and 40-page chapters. They're little snippets, and it makes it so much easier to read, and it's a fun to read book. And again, I encourage everyone listening to go out and get a copy of Chris's book, War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL. And with that, I want to end here. How crucial was military or war football to the formation of professional football as we know it today instead of little small professional leagues scattered throughout the country?
I think that it was critical, really through this military football phenomenon that you saw during World War I. That was just an explosion of high-level amateur football. And it's no coincidence that right after the war, you had an explosion of professional football going from kind of the semi-professional, rinky-dink, small cities to high-level all-stars, guys who had been all-Americans and all-conference and all-whatever players, and significantly all-service players, too, because, again, Walter Camp had the all-service team during World War I. But, these all-star teams of the former college players on military teams really led directly to the birth of the NFL. The NFL was coming sooner or later, but I believe, and the evidence bears it out, there were at least 240 war football veterans who played and coached in the early NFL, including 7 Hall of Famers. And the true number is likely much higher. You had at least 150 other NFL players who were World War I veterans. We just don't have enough documentation to tell of their war football status, whether they played on some of these teams or not. Unfortunately, one of the problems with the press at the time was, they would call a player Smith, and they wouldn't say his first name. It's like, well, right. Which Smith? But right. So it's at least 240, and it's likely much higher of the war football veterans who were involved in the early years of the NFL and helped it to grow and thrive. So, the NFL was coming sooner or later, but I truly believe, and the evidence bears this out, that World War I led to the birth of the NFL 5 or 10 or maybe even 20 years before it would have otherwise been. It's a fascinating story. I'm glad that I discovered it, and I'm really glad that I was able to tell it.
Yeah, you have a great passion. Your enthusiasm for the topic is quite evident. And I want to thank you again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, for taking time out of your evening to spend with me. And wow, what a great topic. And I really enjoyed our conversation this evening.
Thanks, Warren. I enjoyed it a lot, too. As you said, I could talk about this all day. But, for those of you who are interested, you can read plenty more about it in War Football.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Some of the other names I didn't touch upon in today's show were Potsy Clark. We didn't dive deep into Jimmy Conzelman or Frank Pollard or Emmett Keefe. They all have terrific stories. And some of the topics I left out were the AEF tournament, the Third Army Championship, the Mexican Border Tournament, and so much more. If I covered it all, there'd be nothing left for you to read in Chris's book, and we could have spoken for at least another hour or two. I encourage you to pick up a copy of Chris's book, War Football, World War I, and the Birth of the NFL. You won't be disappointed. And it is such an easy read. You'll enjoy it. Thanks again to Chris for taking time out of his evening for another appearance on Sports Forgotten Heroes. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. And I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.